So, welcome back. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a 2, maybe 3-part series over Spring and getting that working. And yeah. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we want to go ahead and download the SBA and get that installed in your computer. I already have it. Accounting MVC. It's right there. The next thing we're going to want to do is import this. So let's go ahead and do an import. Existing projects into Workspace. Click on Browsery. Click on Browse. And then we want to just import that. So pops up over here, and as you can see, obviously it's got some errors, and we're gonna have to figure out what that is. Almost immediately, because it's just imported, I know it's probably something with my build path, and immediately I see it is. I do not have that Jerry. I do not have that the JDBC thing in that location. So I need to edit my JDBC jar and locate mine, and then I need to edit my JRE to be whatever my default is, or whatever works well on your system. Mine is JDK 1.8. But that's not it. I still have some other issues. So let's just go through and check. Apply. I do not have Apache Tomcat 9.0, and my Apache is not there, so I'm going to have to look and figure out what's going on. 2 places to check will be your compiler compliance level. I'm using 1.8, so I need to do it at 1.8. And then I need to check my facets. Java needs to be 1.8. And then I can go back to my targeted runtime, and you can see that my Apache, my server, the one that I actually have, is there. Apply and close. This should get rid of any issues I might have. Okay. Now, before we start doing any of the JSP pages or the controllers, I need to do some initial setup. And to do that, we need to go into our WebXML. Let's stop my server. Clear. Okay. And I also need to do something in my dispatcher servlet. We need to do something in both. Okay. So the first thing is MVC Spring uses what's called a dispatcher system. And if you don't know what that is, I'll talk about it right now. So in normal servlets, what generally happens is you have a bunch of little tiny servlets. So we have servlets, these little circles. Try to make them a little bit more uniform. And then we have JSP pages, which are actually being displayed. And what happens is we start off with the index, I'll label it I, and then that can take you to any servlet using your servlet mappings. And then your servlet can take you to a JSP page or another servlet, and either of these can go wherever they want. And you can kind of already get a feel for the mess that's happening. All this causes problems with your URLs. I know when I was working with servlets, I had issues with request dispatchers and send redirects, either not changing the URL and then changing the URL, and it gets confusing. Even if you're using what we would call a dispatcher servlet. And what that would be is so the dispatcher servlet is generally a very, very large subdivided servlet and this file ends up very, very large. This is the process I used for my case study, and I think that file, when all was said and done, ended up to be something like 1,000 lines of code for a very small project. If you're building a massive website like Amazon, this servlet could end up into the tens of thousands of lines of code, and that's very hard to debug. So to combat that, something called MVC Spring was made. And what it does is it uses something called a dispatcher. What it is it's a servlet that contains some special information. And the special information is essentially pathing. It is allowing us to make a uniform dispatcher system, so all of our user requests, because my user goes through this pathing, and then what that pathing does is it directs to each of what's called controllers. Now these controllers, which I'll do in blue triangles over here, can do multiple different things. They can be subdivided, and you can have multiple methods, much like that very large server that we had before, but they're going to be much smaller, very component based, as opposed to having the whole application in one spot. And then these controllers then send you back to the I'm going to use it in blue. Will then send you back to the original pathing servlet, and then that pathing servlet will then send you on to whatever JSP page you need. So what this does is it creates a uniform URL pattern that is easy to replicate and easy to read. I'm sure that many of you noticed while you were doing servlets that the URL would have a JSP or some other weird thing on it, depending on what you're doing. And then if you're trying to call the controller, you wouldn't have a JSP or anything like that. Also, you'll notice that if we go to any site, we don't get any /JSPs or anything like that. It's because they're using this dispatcher system. Now, what we have to do is we have to build the dispatcher servlet in the WebXML, as well as configure what the dispatcher servlet's going to do inside of the dispatcher servlet XML. So real quick, I'm sure everyone knows how to do a servlet mapping already, so we're going to go ahead and do a servlet mapping. Spell it right. Servlet name. And we're going to call it dispatcher. And then servlet class, org.spring has its own pre-created basic dispatcher. Now I just gotta make sure I spelled that right. ORG Spring Framework name, and then we have to give it a servlet mapping. Dispatcher. URL pattern. Okay. And our URL pattern for the basic dispatcher will be just a slash. This is what we would normally call as index, and it's whatever's displayed first, generally. Now, all of this should be bog standard for your servlets. We just create a servlet name, give it the class it wants to use as the servlet, and then actually give it a URL pattern. Now, the new stuff, the actual Spring thing, is this beans. What a bean is in Spring, it's basically just the information or the methods that Spring is trying to be able to use. So what we have to do is we have to give it all of the methods. Now, Spring is very nice about this, or at least the later parts of Spring is very nice about this. We can do something called a context component scan. Okay. So what this is going to do, is it's going to scan whatever base package we give it for components that we want MVC Spring to actually have access to. And we have to tell it what the base package is. So if you look in our source, all of our packages follow the naming convention. Simple accounting, and then it's dot, and then it's followed by pretty much whatever. So we give it the base package name, whatever's not going to change. So I know a lot of us, when we were creating our own packages, it was like com.perscolas.name. And then it would be, DAO or model or something of that sort. So we would give the base package to be com.perscolas.name. Okay? And this slash basically means that this tag is self-contained. And it doesn't need the ending tag. Like if I were to just do that, we don't need that ending tag. It's pointless. So we can create a self-contained tag by doing a slash with the angle bracket at the end. Okay? Now, we need to set up the basic URL pattern for all of the stuff that we're going to be doing. And how we do this is by creating a bean. Class. And then we have to give it the Spring framework. View. And I know I spelled that wrong, so give me a second to check. This bean class ORG Spring Framework Web Servlet View Internal Resource View Resolver. It's a way to unify all of our URLs. Yeah. So that's basically it. It's just a way to unify all of our URLs. So we have to give it something called a property. And we're going to name it prefix. We're going to then give it a value. /web So what this prefix is going to do for us is if I go to your site, we need to tell it, if we were going to try to load up one of the JSP pages, we would need to tell it to look in to web inf/views, and then we would have to give it a certain name. Let's say login. Then we would have to tell it that it's a JSP page. This is what our normal URL would look like. But giving that prefix makes it so we don't have to do that. It knows that anytime we give it a string called login.jsp, or anytime we type in login.jsp, it's supposed to go ahead and put that web inf / views / and then there. That's what that prefix does. But we also don't want that miscellaneous.jsp. So we're going to have to add in another property. And many of you may have already guessed, we're going to call it a suffix. And then we're going to say, add in the .jsp for me. I don't want to have to do that. And this sets up your bean so that your URLs will be uniform throughout your project. You generally won't have to worry about it. Okay? Now we have to add in one more thing. If we're going to be using our own styling, or if we're going to have images inside of a folder somewhere. As you can see, you have the CSS and images here. We want it to be able to find that easily. Let me see. So we have to give it a tag. We're going to call it resources. Now, it tells us a location, and it tells us the mapping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder called resources. I'm going to finish. I'm going to put the CSS and the images inside of the resources. We have to tell it what the base folder is. So the base folder is resources. That's where all of our CSS and images that we're going to have come with the project, that's where it's going to be at. We then need to be able to tell it to go ahead and look through the entire resources folder for all of the resources. We do this so we don't have to give it a special URL every single time. And how we do that is by putting 2 asterisks there. This will do a forward look. It'll go into resources and generate the resources mapping for each folder and every file inside of that folder. So let's say I had a new file in there. We're going to call it test CSS. What it'll do is it'll create a mapping for that test CSS, and it'll look something like this. I'm going to steal that. So it'll go ahead and automatically generate it'll automatically generate the mapping. It'll go ahead and say that it's resources / CSS / test.css. It'll automatically generate that, so whenever I want to use it, I don't have to do any weird pathfinding or trying to make sure that it's working. I don't have to. So the whole point to do it automatically, and I'm going to delete that because I don't need it right now, is to go back to this uniformity. It's going to automatically generate them every single time. So whenever I want to grab a resource from my resources folder, all I have to do is send it back to the Spring and say, go find this resource for me. And that's the benefit of what we're doing, what we did there. And I actually, so this annotation driven thing here basically is just telling the dispatcher servlet that we're going to add annotations to tell it what to do. That's basically all it's going to do. That's all it's talking about there. And then that's pretty much it. I have a feeling, though, that once we test this in the next video, that I'm going to have to do some pathing. That's always a problem. So that's it for this video. Next video, I'm going to create a test controller and a test view and try and get them working. And then once I do get it working, I'll show you how I get it working, or how I got it working, and then we'll move along and actually populate it. Thanks for watching.